At this point, I should explain what had happened to me since that summer day when I last hugged my dear and wise professor and promised to keep in touch. I did not keep in touch. In fact, I lost contact with most of the people I knew in college, including my beer drinking friends and the first woman I ever woke up with in the morning. The years after graduation hardened me into someone quite different from the strutting graduate who left campus that day, headed for New York City, ready to offer the world his talent. The world I discovered was not all that interested. I wandered around my early 20s, paying rent and reading class fields and wondering why the lights were not turning green for me. My dream was to be a famous musician. I played the piano, but for several years of dark, empty nightclubs, broken promises, bands that kept breaking up, and producers who seemed excited about everyone but me, the dream soured. I was failing for the first time in my life. At the same time, I had my first serious encounter with death. My favorite uncle, my mother's brother, and the man who had taught me music, taught me to drive, teased me about girls, thrown me a football, that one adult whom I targeted as a child and said, "That's who I want to be when I grow up," died of pancreatic cancer at the age of 44. He was a short, handsome man with a thick mustache, and I was with him for the last year of his life, living in an apartment just below his. I watched his strong body wither, then bloat, saw him suffer, night after night, doubled over at the dinner table, pressing on his stomach, his eyes shut, his mouth contorted in pain. The rest of us, my aunt, his two young sons, me, stood there silently, cleaning the plates, averting our eyes. It was the most helpless I have ever felt in my life. One night in May, my uncle and I sat on the balcony of his apartment. It was breezy and warm. He looked out towards the horizon and said, through gritted teeth, that he wouldn't be around to see his kids into the next school year. He asked if I would look after them. I told him not to talk that way. He stared at me sadly. He died a few weeks later. After the funeral, my life changed. I felt as if time were suddenly precious, water going down an open drain, and I could not move quickly enough. No more playing music at half-empty nightclubs, no more writing songs in my apartment, songs that no one would hear. I returned to school. I earned a master's degree in journalism and took the first job offered as a sports writer. Instead of chasing my own fame, I wrote about famous athletes chasing theirs. I worked for newspapers and freelanced for magazines. I worked at a pace that knew no hours, no limits. I would wake up in the morning, brush my teeth, and sit down at the typewriter in the same clothes I had slept in. My uncle had worked for a corporation and hated it. Same thing every day, and I was determined never to end up like him. I bounced around from New York to Florida and eventually took a job in Detroit as a columnist for the Detroit Free Press. The sports appetite in that city was insatiable. They had professional teams in football, basketball, baseball, and hockey, and it matched my ambition. In a few years, I was not only penning columns, I was writing sports books, doing radio shows, and appearing regularly on TV, spouting my opinions on rich football players and hypocritical college sports program. I was part of the media thunderstorm that now soaks our country. I was in demand. I stopped renting, I started buying. I bought a house on a hill, I bought cars, I invested in stocks and built a portfolio. I was cranked to a fifth gear, and everything I did on a deadline. I exercised like a demon. I drove my car at breakneck speed. I made more money than I had ever figured to see. I met a dark-haired woman named Janine who somehow loved me despite my schedule and the constant absences. We married after a 7-year courtship. I was back to work a week after the wedding. I told her and myself that we would one day start a family, something she wanted very much, but that day never came. Instead, I buried myself in accomplishments because with accomplishments, I believed I could control things. I could squeeze in every last piece of happiness before I got sick and died, like my uncle before me, which I figured was my natural fate. As for Maury, well, I thought about him now and then, the things he had taught me about being human and relating to others, but it was always in the distance as if from another life. Over the years, I threw away any mail that came from Brandeis University, figuring they were only asking for money, so I did not know of Maury's illness. The people who might have told me were long forgotten, their phone numbers buried in some packed away box in the attic. It might have stayed that way had I not been flicking through the TV channels late one night when something caught my ear. In March of 1995, a limousine carrying Ted Koppel, the host of ABC TV's Nightline, pulled up to a snow-covered curb outside Maury's house in West Newton, Massachusetts. Maury was in a wheelchair full-time now, getting used to helpers lifting him like a heavy sack from a chair to the bed and a bed to the chair. He had begun to cough while eating, and chewing was a chore. His legs were dead, he would never walk again, yet he refused to be depressed. Instead, Maury had become a lightning rod of ideas. He jotted down his thoughts on yellow pads, envelopes, folders, scrap papers. He wrote bite-sized philosophies about living with death's shadow. Accept what you are able to do and what you are not able to do. Accept the past as past and without denying it or discarding it. Learn to forgive yourself and to forgive others. Don't assume that it's too late to get involved. After a while, he had more than 50 of these aphorisms, which he shared with his friends. One friend, a fellow Brandeis professor named Maurice Stein, was so taken with the words that he sent them to a Boston Globe reporter who came out and wrote a long feature story on Maury. The headline read, "A Professor's Final Course, His Own Death." The article caught the eye of producer from the Nightline show who brought it to Koppel in Washington, D.C. "Take a look at this," the producer said. Next thing you knew, there were cameramen in Maury's living room, and Koppel's limousine was in front of the house. Several of Maury's friends and family members had gathered to meet Koppel, and when the famous man entered the house, they buzzed with excitement, and all except Maury, who wheeled himself forward, raised his eyebrows, and interrupted the calmer with his high sing-song voice. "Ted, I need to check you out before I agree to do this interview." There was an awkward moment of silence, then the two men were ushered into the study. The door was shut. "Man," one friend whispered outside the door, "I hope Ted goes easy on Maury." "I hope Maury goes easy on Ted," said the other. Inside the office, Maury motioned for Koppel to sit down. He crossed his hands in his lap and smiled. "Tell me something close to your heart," Maury began. "My heart?" Koppel studied the old man. "All right," he said cautiously and spoke about his children. They were close to his heart. "Good," Maury said. "Now tell me something about your faith." Koppel was uncomfortable. "I usually don't talk about such things with people I have only known a few minutes." "Ted, I'm dying," Maury said, peering over his glasses. "I don't have a lot of time here." Koppel laughed. "All right. Faith." He quoted a passage from Marcus Aurelius, something he felt strongly about. Maury nodded. "Now let me ask you something," Koppel said. "Have you ever seen my program?" Maury shrugged. Twice, I think. Twice? That's all? Don't feel bad, I've only seen opera once. Well, the 2 times you saw my show, what did you think? Maury paused. To be honest, yes. I thought you were a narcissist. Koppel burst into laughter. I am too ugly to be a narcissist, he said. Soon the cameras were rolling in front of the living room fireplace, with Koppel in his crisp blue suit and Maury in his saggy grey sweater. He had refused fancy clothes or makeup for this interview. His philosophy was that death should not be embarrassing. He was not about to powder its nose. Because Maury sat in the wheelchair, the camera never caught his withered legs, and because he was still able to move his hands, Maury always spoke with both hands waving. He showed great passion when explaining how you face the end of life. Ted, he said, when all this started, I asked myself, am I going to withdraw from the world like most people do, or am I going to live? I decided I'm going to live, or at least try to live, the way I want, with dignity, with courage, with humor, with composure. There are some mornings when I cry and mourn for myself. Some mornings I'm so angry and bitter, but it doesn't last too long. Then I get up and say I want to live. So far I've been able to do it. Will I be able to continue? I don't know, but I'm betting on myself that I will. Koppel seemed extremely taken with Maury. He asked about the humility that death induced. Well, Fred, Maury said accidentally, then he quickly corrected himself. I mean Ted. Now that's inducing humility, Koppel said, laughing. The two men spoke about afterlife. They spoke about Maury's increasing dependency on other people. He already needed help eating and sitting and moving from place to place. What Koppel asked, did Maury dread the most about his slow, insidious decay? Maury paused. He asked if he could say this certain things on television. Koppel said, go ahead. Maury looked straight into the eyes of the famous interviewer in America. Well, Ted, one day soon someone's gonna have to wipe my ass. The program aired on the Friday night. It began with Ted Koppel from behind the decks in Washington, his voice booming with authority. Who is Maury Schwartz? He said, and why by the end of the night are so many of you are going to care about him?